It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Holland back to Madison. For those of you who don't know Professor Holland, she received her PhD in the history department here in 2013 and has gone on to an illustrious career as a historian of the American West in particular. And she's here today to talk about some aspects of her current book project. Her first book project, though, was a really monumental piece of historical scholarship in its own right. It's called Tiny U. It's a Western history of the anti-abortion movement, and won a lot of awards. Anybody that's interested in the history of the American West, the history of abortion and the anti-abortion movement, there's a lot for a lot of different constituencies to find and admire in that book. And just to keep things brief, because people are not here to hear me talk, I would just point out that what Professor Holland is going to share with us today is coming out of the book that is tentatively titled, I don't know if this is still true, Straightening Out, A History of Anti-Queer Politics in Rural America, which examines battles around queer rights and sexuality in the rural American West between the 1970s and the 2000s. In the book, Professor Holland shows strategies for victory the progressives waged, but also the fact that they often ignored rural parts of the state, banking on the urban vote to secure gay rights. And meanwhile, and I take from the title, this is sort of the gist of this particular lecture, conservatives organized in rural towns relentlessly, infusing anti-queer and anti-feminist politics into places as mundane as the local grocery store. And so it is my deep pleasure to welcome back to Madison the L.R. Brammer Jr. Presidential Professor of U.S. History at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Jennifer Holland.
Thanks so much for having me to the Havens Wright Center and to Adrian Pajic, and especially also for Simon Balto with me also. It's like really amazing and wonderful to be back here where I spent so much time. This special. And as Simon said, this is, or as Dr. Balto said,
it's okay.
This slide is drawn from this larger book, really about, it really answered the question, how did rural places become sort of the bastions of social conservatism? I think a lot of people just assume they always were, but I'm really charting the ways in which this was a political process. That actually, if we looked at the 70s, queer movements, if we're looking anyway, queer movements were more invested in rural places than these sort of anti-gay movements, but that in the 80s and 90s, that would shift. And especially statewide gay organizations and national organizations pull back from rural spaces and really invest themselves almost exclusively in metropolitan voters, urban, suburban. And there always were queer people, queer activists in rural places, but they sort of get left behind in these like shifts as conservatives really begin to invest themselves more and more in rural places. And this talk actually is born from the early parts of the book before this big transition. I am going to talk to you about the very beginning of the anti-queer movement in the United States, the grassroots version of that movement, at least. And it doesn't actually begin in Miami, Florida, or Anita Bryant, as people often remember, but it started 3 years earlier in Boulder, Colorado. So let me start here. This is not moving. Oh, wait, here we go. Okay, I got it. Okay, so Hilma Skinner stood at the microphone in front of the Boulder City Council for neither the first or the last time in 1974. She wasn't particularly tall, but Skinner was imposing with her stern demeanor and also, as you can see, her monumental beehive hairdo. On this day in February 74, she was speaking against a proposed citywide ordinance that would have barred job discrimination based on sexual orientation in Boulder. And if it had passed, Boulder, Colorado would have joined just a handful of cities and college towns that were beginning to protect their gay citizens from some forms of discrimination. And of course, these local measures were necessary because under federal law, gay people were not a protected class. It was totally legal to fire them or evict them for being gay. Boulder's anti-discrimination ordinance, Skinner warned, would make Boulder a sexual deviant mecca. And that night, she rechristened the city Lesbian-Homoville. And actually, the name stuck. Some people say that actually people put it up over the Boulder sign for a little while. I'm not exactly sure that's true, but it didn't stick because for some people, this ad hoc town motto with this expression of mourning for this older conservative Boulder that seemed to be slipping away, for Boulder's gay community, it was aspirational, right? Could Boulder be a haven for queer people? But for Skinner and so many other budding conservative activists, Lesbian-Homoville was a dark fantasy and also a call to action. And in fact, that year in Boulder, Hilma Skinner was a part of the very first anti-queer grassroots political campaign in the United States. Now, of course, local and state and federal laws has sustained anti-queer discrimination to varying degrees across U.S. history. But these laws were not the product of mass political movements. These would not arise until 1974. So at the city council meeting in February of that year, Hilma Skinner brought a petition with over 1,500 names asking the council not to pass this anti-discrimination ordinance. And conservatives were already threatening a referendum on the proposed law and also a recall of any city council members who voted for it. And over the next year, 1974 in Boulder, the city was engulfed in the promised referendum and recall campaigns. So this very first anti-queer grassroots movement was nurtured not in a southern city, not Anita Bryant's Miami, but in a college town in the American West. Boulder at that time was a town of 75,000, and it was in the middle of this wrenching metamorphosis. People were arguing over the direction of city growth and the politics of the city. And actually, in this moment, Boulder social conservatives did not foreground the vulnerability of children, as Anita Bryant's group and so many anti-gay activists after her would. Instead, in this moment, there was a coalition of religious conservatives and pro-growth professionals that spoke in the language of landlords and employers and the newly disadvantaged white male straight. Right? And together, they argued that gay people did not seek equal rights. They sought, quote, special privileges. And they imagined that gay rights would be eventually acted out through visceral sexualized disorder in public space. And so this 1974 battle became a place that city residents expressed their concerns not only about homosexuality, but gendered and racial anti-discrimination laws as a whole, and a broader project of sexual modernity and the effect that might have on these local small town economies. The Boulder is really the beginning of this experiment with anti-gay, anti-democratic direct democracy, which the movement would use over and over and over again over the next 50 years. And there, conservative activists leveraged local politics and local power to conjure this multifaceted queer danger, one that had the potential to alter every relationship in an interaction in this small town. So from one vantage point, this movement in Boulder began with a battle between the liberal university and the conservative town. So in the late 60s, Boulder already had a reputation as being a home to free thinkers and environmentalists and intellectuals, of course, because the University of Colorado was there. But the city's reputation for liberalism really outpaced the actual politics of the town. Boulder County and Boulder itself was long considered Republican territory and had been since the New Deal. At this point, liberalism was really confined to campus and its increasingly vocal student body. And young people were very loud, especially by the summer of 1969. That summer, radical students and local members of the counterculture were joined by what one journalist called millions of hippies from out of town. In 1969 alone, students disrupted lectures and an ROTC event. They occupied university buildings. They protested police brutality, all while hippies lounged, slept, smoked pot, played music, and danced on city streets and in public parks. And in response, what was then a conservative city council wrote a host of new laws regulating the uses of public space, but those laws were exclusively applied to young people in town. And at that point, the university didn't have much ability to respond because its students, while noisy, were disenfranchised because they could not vote in 1969 in Colorado. And that all changed in 1971. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote, was ratified in 71. And so all of a sudden, students could actually vote and really reshape the politics of college towns. And so in 1972, the city's voters, with all these newly enfranchised students, radically altered the composition of the city council in Boulder. And so 4 conservative incumbents were replaced by a Black lawyer, a white co-op bookstore owner, a white feminist professor, and a white environmentalist. One journalist said that election turned Boulder politics upside down. And so beginning in 1972, there was a section of town that believed that this city council was radical and illegitimate, and that was before they proposed a gay rights ordinance. So from one point of view, this conservative movement against the anti-gay discrimination ordinance began with this fight over political power in the divided town. But from another vantage point, the movement in Boulder began with an abortion clinic. Soon after Roe versus Wade legalized abortion across the country in 1973, a local doctor and psychiatrist started planning a freestanding abortion clinic in Boulder. It would have been the first of its kind and was the first of its kind in the state. And immediately a small group of religious people in Boulder began building an organization to oppose the creation of the clinic. And so in October 1973, Catholic activists joined by a handful of Protestants, as so many anti-abortion organizations were then, pleaded with this new city council to stop the clinic, set to open just a few days later. And these activists, of course, spoke in this emerging language of the anti-abortion movement, focusing on graphic discussions of damaged fetal bodies and historical comparisons to the Holocaust and slavery. But they also spoke in this more localized language of health and environment. So the initial petition said the new clinic was a public nuisance because it was near a Catholic elementary school and a junior high, and thus was an undesirable environment for the young people in those schools. Other activists imagined that Boulder would become, this is a quote, the land of milk and honey, where immoral young girls gather to frolic in our cut-rate abortion clinic. And they said that frolicking would draw even more drug-glazed male crazy. So this newly formed Fight the Abortion Clinic group, that was their name, asked the Department of Health to step in. They argued that the clinic's shag carpeting harbored infectious germs. And in all these arguments, they're really hoping, as so many anti-abortion activists after them would, that stringent regulation would drive out abortion providers out of business. And so activists are really imagining an immorality, a quote-unquote immorality that had very concrete public manifestations. They imagine desperate, lost women coming in droves to the city, perhaps occupying its parks and sidewalks as the hippies had. The clinic's infectious germs couldn't be contained within the building, and the frolicking women would track these germs out into the population. And finally, conservatives imagined that these corrupting influences could reach young, impressionable girls, right? The miasma of abortion could easily cross 500 feet to an unsuspecting Catholic school. And so they're really imagining abortion, this sin of abortion, corrupting the city itself. And so they immediately demand a local response. But the Boulder City Council said they could do nothing for them, right? The clinic was zoned properly, and they said the Supreme Court prevented them from infringing on a woman's right to an abortion. Afterwards, and this is a quote, a core of morally indignant citizens left City Hall angry and vengeful. And those citizens that would become the backbone of Boulder's anti-gay organization formed less than 3 months later after that meeting about the abortion clinic. So stalwarts of Fight the Abortion Clinic Committee became the heart of the Boulder Recall Committee. Because these social conservatives really faced a new world in 1973, where the federal government was robustly protecting some sexual rights, especially related to birth control and abortion, but not others, because there was no Roe versus Wade for queer people. In 1973, Boulder social conservatives couldn't stop those imagined frolicking immoral girls or their supposedly diseased abortion clinic, but they could stop gay civil rights. On issues of homosexuality, social conservatives could still exert enormous local power. And they would have the opportunity to do so just a few months later. So in 1973, a handful of students who were a part of this group called Boulder Gay Liberation approached City Councilman Penfield Tate, you can see here, and asked him to draft an anti-discrimination ordinance protecting just job rights for gay people. That was the extent of the anti-discrimination law. Gay Liberation had noted similar ordinances were being passed in other towns, and they hoped that, just a handful of them, but they thought the same could be done in Boulder. And in another city councilman's hands, Gay Liberation's petition might have been quickly tabled. But Councilman Penfield Tate was unusual in a lot of ways, and he was particularly open to the group's arguments. Tate was the lawyer who was elected in the transformative 1972 election. And throughout his life, Tate has had experienced both personal and institutional forms of racism. At a steel mill where he worked when he was young, and then when he was in the Air Force, he watched as he nor no other Black person was allowed to move up the professional ladder in either of those spaces. And then once he was in law school in Boulder, he faced very similar challenges from other reporters. He and 4 other Black men asked to join the Boulder Elks Lodge, but were denied both because of the color of their skin. And then after he graduated from law school in Boulder, he got involved in city politics, and he eventually ran in the city council election of 1971-72. In January 1974, the city council chose him to be mayor. That's how Boulder, chooses the mayor. You don't get elected, you get chosen from the city council. And then with that, Tate became Boulder's first and only Black mayor and the first in the state of Colorado. So Councilman, soon to be mayor, Penfield Tate, was immediately sympathetic to these gay students when they approached him in 1973. Tate said he saw so many parallels between his life experiences and theirs. Of course, he knew the damage of job discrimination. He had felt that very, very clearly. But he also said he understood the shame of the closet. He had always lived as a Black man, but some Black people he knew who he grew up with had not. So this is what he told a reporter. I lived in this small town in Ohio where the industrial North meets the rural South. A lot of Black people would come back home from the big city, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, where they were living as whites. When they came home, they had to be Black again. I saw this again and again throughout my life. Black people having to live 2 lives. I saw the tremendous pain and division people had to go through because they couldn't give up being respectable and white on the one hand and Black and traditional on the other hand. And so here Tate is really not imagining race as biological, stable, and always clearly visible, right? He is in that, and as opposed to a homosexuality that could be hidden or malleable, right? I mean, he always lived as a Black person, but he knew people who hadn't. For him, Black people and gay people shared discrimination when they were seen, and also tremendous pain when they hid. And so he said they had these similar experiences and thus should be protected in the same ways. And so he agreed to include sexual orientation in this broader human rights ordinance. And at first, the story of Boulder's ordinance paralleled the story in other cities and college towns. There was a first reading in December 1973. Council passed it unanimously. And had Boulder followed the path of other cities, the second reading would have been uncontroversial. Most places that passed these a lot of the public didn't even know they were being considered. And then the ordinance quickly becomes law. But that didn't happen in Boulder. The conservative local paper, the Boulder Daily Camera, they immediately accused the city council of trying to sneak this ordinance by the people and said it really was an ordinance that was about protecting homosexuals. And so the second reading had to be postponed because there was outrage from conservatives in town. So there were contentious public hearings in early winter 1974. Helmut Skinner with the beehive hairdo, and all these other social conservatives spoke vehemently against the ordinance. Gay students and their allies spoke too, but they were at a disadvantage because there were still a lot of people are still scared to speak publicly. Even straight people said sometimes they were scared to speak publicly in support of gay people and worried about losing their jobs. The newly formed Boulder Recall Committee angrily told the city council that if they passed the ordinance, the group would start collecting signatures for repeal of the law through referendum and a recall of all city council members who supported it. And so in February, the council first voted for the ordinance 5-4, but then they changed their minds because there was so much outrage. So they severed the sexual orientation part from the rest of the human rights ordinance and put it to the vote of the people through the referendum. But this didn't satisfy the Boulder Recall Committee. So in April 1974, the group distributed petitions to recall Mayor Penfield Tate and Councilman Tim Fuller. These are the only two who could be recalled under Boulder law. The other three had voted for it, had been elected too recently. And so 350 volunteers circulate these petitions. And after only 3 weeks, the group had over 10,000 signatures, well over the required number. And according to the newspaper, the largest number of names for any petition drive in the city's history. So over the next 6 months, April to September 1974, it seemed as if all anyone could talk about in Boulder was homosexuality. The referendum happened first in May and the recall not until September. And they said sexuality was a conversation people avoided before this, but during the ordinance fight, it became an everyday discussion item. So one Boulder explained, our friends are constantly talking about the recall, even at bridge games. And some really bemoaned that they said, we used to, this kind of speech only happened before on graffiti bathroom walls, right? But there was a flood of words in print and at the bridge table. And in these words, the Boulder Recall Committee conjured a Lesbian-Homoville, a dark fantasy about a city without a closet. You can see here all the homosexual 1, 2, 3. It's like there's so many people writing in, they can't even give them real titles. They're just like enumerating them, you know? And in the fantasy of Lesbian-Homoville, activists drew on their anti-abortion work and the concern over local economies to imagine this corrupting queer force that would transform workplaces and city streets. So Mayor Penfield Tate and Councilman Tim Fuller were the sort of main faces of the anti-gay, like they were the main targets, of course, of the anti-gay campaign. Tate got the brunt of conservative ire at first. He was obviously the mayor, the one who had proposed the ordinance, and not insignificantly a Black man. And so when the council first chose Tate as mayor, his opponents denied any racial animus, but according to one journalist, quote, references which proved otherwise were muttered off the record. And those mutterings quickly took the time-worn shape of miscegenation rumors. Some claimed that Tate was having an affair with Deputy Mayor Karen Padgett, the feminist elected in the 1972 election. One person called the newspaper to predict that the two would probably marry each other before the year was out, and both of them were already married, right? And then when Tate and Padgett supported the human rights ordinance, those same people claimed that their supposed interracial extramarital affair was the real motive. Now, because this claim makes so little sense, like a gay anti-discrimination law would have no effect on these two straight people already married, like it had no effect on them. But because people are bringing this up, it shows the power that racialized transgressive sexuality had in Boulder's community at this moment. Those who whispered off the record summoned an amorphous queer danger, not unlike the abortion miasma, which would unleash all kinds of sexual chaos across the city. So if conservatives first focused on two types of sexualized identities, Black man and feminist, they quickly added a third, gender queer hippie. Oof. Tim Fuller was the 30-year-old co-op bookstore owner elected in that 1972 election. He had been a member of Students for a Democratic Society and the broader youth culture, counterculture. And once the recall committee realized they couldn't recall the feminist, Karen Paget, Tim Fuller became the focus of the rest of their conservative anger. Conservatives saw Fuller and other male hippies as a bit queer, partly because of their hair. Right? For men in the counterculture, long hair was this political statement about individuality and the value of nonconformity and youth. But critics, of course, from the 60s onwards said that this was a sign of effeminacy and a sign that men and women could no longer be told apart. One local explained Fuller, long hair defined him. Thus, partly because of hippie queerness, Fuller became the implied stand-in for the gay community during the ordinance fight. Now, Mayor Tate's imagined sexual transgression shape-shifted once he was joined with the queer Fuller rather than the feminist Paget. So Tate received a lot of hate mail that year, and much of it referred to him as the African Queen. He got much more explicit phone calls than that. So these two men, Mayor Tate and Councilman Fuller, became the faces of the gay rights ordinance, but anti-gay conservatives painted this broader picture of the havoc that the ordinance would wreak if it passed. So members of the recall committee suggested that, of course, the ordinance would lead to a mass migration of gay people to the city, and some might even move there just to vote on this issue. Others wrote into the city council terrified that these gay people would do more than vote. One couple asked the council, "And how will you explain men making love in the middle of your street?" You laugh, but this is actually a variation on the fear that the Colorado legislature had expressed a couple years earlier. When that legislature decriminalized sodomy, it added a new law prohibiting gay public sexual expression, including any kissing or gay touching in public. They said that this would amount to a gross flouting of public standards. So for both Boulder social conservatives and Colorado lawmakers, gay rights was very likely to unleash public gay sex. So some spent their time worrying about the streets, but the Boulder Recall Committee spent most of their time focused on the workplace and the rental unit. The group said business people had the right to hire and fire who they wanted, and realtors had the right to evict whoever they wanted. But the problem of the gay employee was imagined as a sexual one. Boulder conservatives foretold a future where gay employees, sometimes in makeup and queer dress, would proposition clients and coworkers. And conservatives said this would be very different than the kind of propositions, the heterosexual propositions that happen regularly in the workplace at this time. They said, conservatives said that in Lesbian-Homoville, gay employees would be out, hypersexual, and making advances. And because of this new anti-discrimination statute, they could not be fired. One lamented, "The only way you'll be able to fire a lesbian is to bring in your business records and your church affiliation records from the age 10 on, including a note from your mother and your pastor." They said gay people would simply go to the city's human rights department and say that their firing was a product of anti-gay feeling. And then that accusation would be impossible to prove. So you could never fire a gay person for any reason, they said. So this primary line of argument was the product of the coalition that actually was at the heart of this recall committee. So it started, as I said, with religious people who were really early anti-abortion activists, but it quickly got support from realtors and businessmen from across the city. So the city's Chamber of Commerce, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and some of the most prestigious businessmen in town lent their names to the cause. They didn't like this ordinance, but they also hated the city council for a whole host of reasons. So businessmen and realtors distributed petitions at their office and apartment complexes. They donated to the campaign. They signed public statements against the ordinance. So if the realtors and businessmen are supplying the language of property rights and employer rights, anti-abortion activists contributed warnings about sexualized affirmative action. Zenon Rezikowski, who was the leader of the Boulder Recall Committee, he argued, "This plea for rights is nothing more than a thinly disguised plea for preferential status." He said that really anti-discrimination laws were a way that gay people sought preferential hiring. They sought gay quotas and a tool to prevent firing. He said homosexuals want minority status. And so this line of argument created in Boulder in 74 would pop up again and again over many anti-gay campaigns over the subsequent decades. And conservatives said over and over again, really the opposite of what Tate said, right? Conservatives said gay people were unlike women and certainly unlike people of color, who they said had a biological, visible difference that led to their mistreatment. A Boulder social conservative explained homosexuality is a matter of choice, like alcoholism, drug addiction, or compulsive gambling. They said gay people were to be pitied or punished, but not protected. And it's not surprising that this line of argument started with these white anti-abortion activists. Of course, religious people were much more sympathetic to arguments around sinful acts rather than identities. But these people were also already a part of a nationwide socially conservative movement. Anti-abortion activists argued again and again that fetuses deserve the rights of any born person, but they were particularly outraged when anyone they considered, quote, unworthy got rights that the quote unquote innocent did not. And so it must have been particularly maddening to see gay people, those people they considered sinners and lawbreakers and demoralizers, get some kind of equal rights in this context. This was a world turned upside down for these social conservatives. So also in Boulder, conservatives really didn't hide the racial and gendered resentments embedded in anti-gay arguments very well. Activists often slip from gay people shouldn't have preferential status, and by that they meant discrimination protections, to no one should have those. So most of these activists argued that the US Constitution in its original form already provided everyone of the same rights, and thus there was no need for any anti-discrimination laws of any kind. But other conservatives took this a step further. They said rights in America were necessarily unequal. So Mary Connor, the woman you see here, she told a reporter, people have to earn their rights. They don't already have them. She said the country would be undone if gay people had the normal rights of human beings. Some demanded that the city abolish its Human Relations Department, which investigated local discrimination. Others mocked the city's efforts to support single mothers. One said, Boulder shouldn't worry about the fact that we have some women who have unhappy lives. And others were very angry at the city of Boulder's attempt at an affirmative action plan, which, to be clear, by the fall of 1974, amounted to 7 months of meetings by a very dysfunctional task force. There was no outcome. Now, the background picture is not from Boulder. It's from an anti-busing protest in Boston, but it's happening in 1974, same year, right? These are like these are happening at the exact same time. And I think we can see the parallel arguments and resentments that are coming up in both of these. So as was common throughout this campaign, Helmut Skinner, the Beehive, was the one who cut to the chase. She said that because of our laws on the books that prohibiting discrimination based on race, creed, sex, color, national origin, or religion, she said our basic rights have already been infringed upon. And she said adding sexual orientation to that list amounted to pyramiding wrongs. She said that Boulder already had an affirmative action program to import minorities to fill the quota. That was not true. And she said now gay people would flock to new gay quota spots that the ordinance would create. Skinner, though, didn't step too far away from the party line with these comments. In recall ads and letters to supporters, the Boulder Recall Committee said that Tate and Fuller's real goal was to create a, quote, diversified city. So class, religious politics, and this not subtle criticism of anti-discrimination laws actually eventually led to a schism in Boulder's anti-gay coalition. So in April 1974, two prominent businessmen split from the recall committee and formed their own group and took a lot of the other businessmen with them. These were sort of the who's who of Boulder conservatives. And one founder of that new group said of the recall committee, they're not sophisticated people. They didn't even participate in politics before this. But of course they had. But this guy had been a former city councilman. He just didn't think the anti-abortion movement was sophisticated political action. And also this new group had ads that revealed that this broader attack on anti-discrimination laws might have been a point of controversy. They wrote to Boulder's residents, "We strongly support traditional anti-discrimination legislation, but this particular ordinance would abolish your freedom." There was one voice, as there often was, who began to use more explicit language in more radical tones, and that was Hilma Skinner. She openly talked about homosexual recruitment. She said, they want to convert the streets to their way of life. And she went door to door with recall petitions. And when she did, she spoke not just of employers' rights, but about gay sex. She said gay people were, quote, confused as to the true function of sex and substitute an unreal, plastic, unnatural sex activity for the natural, real sex function. So unlike other conservatives in the early 70s who seemed still restrained by the codes of polite speech around sexuality, Skinner asked her neighbors to use their sexual imagination. In what ways was gay sex unreal and plastic? Skinner used this double-edged sword of disgust and titillation to draw both interest and outrage, as many anti-gay activists after her would. Now, Skinner never confessed to her own pleasure, but she told a reporter in detail about how painful it was to spend 8 hours with the descriptions of gay sex rolling off her tongue. Because bodies mattered to Hilma Skinner. Those bodies and the sex they had were a part of a broader communist plot to undermine America, she said. So there was one version of Lesbian-Homoville that circulated in the newspapers, a vision of sexualized workplaces and gay propositions, hamstrung employers and entitled gay employees. And on people's doorsteps, Hilma Skinner spun an alternative vision. In her hands, Lesbian-Homoville was a place filled with dangerous pleasures, those of plastic sex and communism. Eventually, Hilma Skinner ran afoul of the recall committee she had helped found. She explained that the group had asked her to speak, but said, I could not mention God or the Bible when I spoke. I immediately said I wouldn't have any part of it. And then the split intensified when the recall committee refused to endorse her when she ran for city council to replace any recalled members. Because ultimately, the recall committee worried that Skinner, with her angry, radical, and erotic speech, made them look bad, made them look like the unsophisticated religious people that the businessmen said they were. So one might assume that all visions of Lesbian-Homoville sprang from the imaginations of those unfamiliar with real gay people. Gay activists would assert this again and again. You don't really know them, right? It's a fear of the unknown. But that was not true in Boulder in 1974, and really wasn't true after that either. A number of these early anti-gay activists said explicitly that their politics came from their real experiences with gay people. And there was a number of them, but I'll tell you one story. A recall committee member who founded the group, not Hilma, told an intimate story. She told reporters that she had firsthand knowledge of dealing with homosexuals because she had been married to one. Her 12-year marriage had ended painfully 5 years earlier, and she excised her ex-husband from all future autobiographies and her obituary. We don't know if her claim was true. But if it was, this activist had someone very specific in mind when she told of the dangers of queer people. She turned her shame and her sense of betrayal into a campaign for collective punishment in this early campaign. There was a prominent gay person that most Boulder recall members would have known, and that was Councilman Tim Fuller. Fuller came to Boulder with his boyfriend, who he called a companion and friend he would live with for the next 50 years. And Fuller said of his election to city council, I didn't run on the gay thing, but was open among the inner circle. This was way before Harvey Milk. Tim Fuller's sexuality was clearly not a secret, even among Boulder's conservatives. But here, anti-gay conservatives abide by this long-term tradition in small towns. They knew how to speak in code about their neighbors. So George Boland, who was the candidate who was endorsed by the recall committee, said of Fuller, we aren't oriented in a parallel way. Now, he seemed to be speaking about Fuller's political orientation, but this statement had really different resonances in a community that had been obsessed with sexual orientation for the previous year. So Boulder conservatives railed against Tim Fuller, the long-haired communist hippie corrupting the city, while speaking in quieter tones about Tim Fuller, the real man with this different orientation. So Lesbian-Homoville was filled certainly with dark phantoms, but they sat alongside real neighbors and friends and husbands. So conservative fantasies about a future with queer rights really were rooted in a multipolar fear. These activists saw danger everywhere in the face of their Black mayor and their feminist city councilwoman, in the routine reports of a human resources department, in long-haired young people, and in their gay neighbors. And they thought that a gay rights ordinance had the potential to change real relationships in a town like Boulder. They said that this kind of ordinance would transform public and private spaces and all the relationships that occurred there. They said that gay rights and potentially civil rights more generally would give Boulder a dark future. So not only was this the first anti-gay movement, it was the first successful one. Anti-gay activists won in Boulder in 1974. In May of that year, 2/3 of Boulder voters cast their vote against the gay anti-discrimination ordinance through the referendum. You can see the map on the right. The red are the only districts that supported the ordinance. They were right around campus, but there weren't enough people who came out to vote to actually make a difference. 4 months later, in the recall elections, Tim Fuller was recalled by 51% of the Boulder voters. Mayor Penfield Tate kept his job by a very slim margin, but not for long. Over the next 2 years, he would lose his seat on the city council and also an election to the Colorado State House. At one point, many had believed he would end up in Congress one day, but instead, quote, he watched his promising political future slip away. Tate did not regret proposing the ordinance, though. He said, "If I lived to be 1,000 years old, I would still believe in giving civil rights to these people." Now, because this fight in Boulder received at the time little national attention, many political observers and scholars have sort of dismissed it as unimportant to the story of gay rights or the movement that rose up to oppose those rights. For many, Anita Bryant's campaign in Florida feels part of a national campaign, while Boulder's referendum and recall are obscure and disconnected. They are local. And yet, I think these arguments ignore the way that all anti-gay politics were local. The local was the terrain upon which anti-gay campaigns were fought. By the 70s, many conservatives felt politically impotent as the federal government protected an expanded set of individual and collective rights for both women and racial minorities. And anti-gay politics were a salve to those people. Social conservatives relished the way that the local still mattered when it came to homosexuality. They enthusiastically wielded local political tools, local political institutions, and more broadly, the tools of direct democracy against gay rights. And yet, I don't think local means isolated. In the last decades of the 20th century, local conservative movements observed, connected with, and took inspiration from other movements across the country. Racialized and gendered resentment supplied the political energy for this first campaign and helped to form some of these strategies that would be used over and over again. The beleaguered white male street employee and employer were explicitly and implicitly victims of gay people, but also the politicians who allowed them out of the closet. But really, anyone could be accidental witness to the public gay bacchanal that surely would be unleashed with an anti-discrimination law, according to them. So in the middle and the aftermath of this ordinance battle, Colorado's young people and gay people mourned their losses, often through mockery. In myriad jokes, the anti-gay movement had the face of Helma Skinner. In 1974, students across Colorado participated in a streaking craze where students broke laws and ran naked through campus. And that year, University of Colorado students dedicated their big streaks to Helma Skinner. And then gay people elaborated on these jokes with their own campy twists. So Hilda Skinless, you can see here, became a regular character in plays at the local gay coffee house. In the Lavender Valley soap opera, Skinless, who, quote, drinks only for medicinal purposes, alternately rails against sex and also herself streaks, often through safe way. In later forums, gay Boulder writers imagined Skinner at a local KKK meeting wearing a long robe with pearls and accepting a glowing neon picture of Jesus. In her various forms, Skinner was a secret exhibitionist, a killjoy, a white supremacist, a God believer, a hypocrite, and always an enemy. But Skinner was more than a punchline. Through these jokes, gay people could try to tame the danger that she presented. It was Hilma Skinner who showed the ways that righteous anger and erotic speech could stoke deep concerns about queer people and social change. She could express deep fears about feminism, racial justice, and sexual modernity in a way that tapped into people's emotions and resonated with a certain section of Boulder's residents. And she did foretell a certain strand of the anti-gay movement. Her overt religiosity, her bodily obsessions, and her radical rage would become very common parts of anti-gay movements over the next 50 years. Those activists, those future activists, centered dramatic, graphic discussions of gay sex and supposed gay crimes, often of children, in their campaigns. But in this, Hilma Skinner and other future anti-queer activists identified the twin towers of desire and disgust. And with those in hand, they made claims about the insidious forces of that these insidious forces would corrupt youth and their communities. And they said their gay neighbors would lead to the collapse of America. So if we have Skinner's radical rage plus the recall committee's resentment, these together would be showcased in anti-gay recalls, referendums, and initiatives well into the 21st century, as social conservatives demanded the right to discriminate against their queer neighbors.
I have a question in your description of Mayor Tate's background. You mentioned that he knew African Americans who had come north. It was part of the labor migration, and then returned south, and a sense of being white in the north, Black when they returned south. I didn't quite understand how that would play out in reality. I mean, with Black skin being immutable.
Well, he was saying it wasn't. I mean, these were people who were light-skinned, and so they would. He was saying that when they were in the north, they passed and lived as white people, and then, but when they came home, of course, people would know them, and also they would be a part of these communities, and so they were Black. I mean, there was a part also I cut out that I think is true for even someone like Tate, that he often said he felt he needed to be two versions of himself in different contexts. You know, so because he said he learned over time to be very responsive to the needs of white people as a matter of survival. And so I think there's this one thing about people who were able to sort of live white in one situation and Black in another. But even for someone like Tate, who never could live as a white person, and he still felt like he had to be two versions of himself. And so I think there were two different things that he saw going on that made them sort of, him understand the plight of Black people and gay people as similar.
And Markia Silverman Rodriguez is asking, would love to hear more about your methods for this work, mostly archival, or were oral history or other interviews conducted too? Either way, what did the data collection process look like for you?
Question. Yeah, so my first book, I did my own oral histories quite a bit, and they were hard because I was interviewing a lot of conservatives, and it was just a very intense emotional process. And so I have used oral histories in this, but they aren't ones I collected myself. And the beauty is that university archives and also queer history organizations have just been doing incredible work at collecting, sort of written collection, but also these beautiful oral histories. So, Mayor Tate, his wife, Tim Fuller, like all of them, a lot of the gay liberation groups, they have oral histories. And even some of those Boulder City Council, I don't know how they got this. This is amazing. This is online. Boulder City Council recordings of some of those hearings are just fully digital. You can hear every single voice from some of those hearings in 1974. And those were paired with sort of more traditional archival sources. But it really is the work of queer historians and archivists who've been collecting not only queer movements, but the opposition too, right? They've been doing both of those things. And that really is the source base for this and all the other chapters. I still haven't done any oral histories myself, but I might do a few. But there's so many that like, in some ways, you don't need to, even the rural voices very quickly fall out of the gay archive. So that is actually the particular problem, not the queer voices, but if you're queer and rural or conservative and rural, those become harder to find. And so I have to sort of work my way back through that. Yeah.
My question is poorly thought out. I shouldn't say it. I shouldn't characterize it that way. I don't know if there is any sort of connective tissue between A and C, but I'm thinking about sort of extremist politics in the West, including in Colorado. Like I think I was thinking about this because like I know like Kathleen Blue is from Colorado and is writing like, you know, as like the preeminent white power historian is writing a new book about Colorado in the 90s. And so I'm just like, I'm wondering if they're like, where these people go politically, like, and it's not to say that they're like leaving society and like, you know, joining the white power movement, but I'm just like, maybe they are, but I doubt that Sheila Skinner is. But so like, I'm just sort of thinking about the longer term, like, where do these people take us?
Well, these people, it's sort of these particular activists, sometimes it's hard to trace. One of them actually becomes a, I sort of love this. This is going to be one of my chapters, but she becomes a romance novelist, but she's writing anti-LDS evangelical romance novels. Like weird, but a lot of them sort of fall out. But there is this connection to white supremacy if later, because you know there is like white supremacists move, especially to places like Idaho and Oregon, right? They imagine this Aryan nation can be formed up in the Pacific Northwest, as Kathleen's narrated. And so, especially when you have like Oregon and Idaho become centers of these anti-gay initiatives in the 90s, and gay activists are tracing the ways in which white supremacist organizations are donating to the anti-gay organizations.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of these churches that are the basis of like that are spouting a lot of this like white supremacist ideology are also doing organizing for anti-gay movements. Of course, anti-gay movements are trying to like say that's not us, right? But they very much, I think, are actually on the ground, very interlinked. And certainly anti-gay and white supremacist mobilizations are happening in these small towns in the Upper West simultaneously. So like, you know, petitions for an anti-gay initiative are alongside people like Aryan Nation, people papering like car parking lots with white supremacist organizations. They are often the same people, but they're certainly happening and feeding into similar resentments, right? Coming out of certain segments of rural populations. But I think that ultimately anti-gay movements try to stay on the formal side of the political process. And so like in a place like Oregon, their main interest is attacking both gays, obviously, but really also the Oregon Republican Party. Because the Republican Party is not actually lined up with anti-gay movements. In certain places, like it takes a really long time for them to actually line up. So they're regressing, and eventually they do, you know, by the 21st century, they have taken over, as we've seen these like radical movements, right, take over Republican parties, even in a place like Oregon, who were electing like pro-choice, pro-gay Republicans well into the 90s. But anti-gay movements are trying to sort of, they just like anti-abortion activists, they have these overlapping constituencies. They have a lot of work that's being done simultaneously. They're building on the same resentments, but there's like this strategic distance that they need to manufacture to say we're not involved in like Aryan Nation stuff. But there is like so much overlap.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll ask a question. So growing up in Colorado, I was a young person when Colorado failed to pass Amendment 2. Yes. In 1992, which was another anti-discrimination law to protect LGBTQ people. And what really strikes me about the argument that you made during your lecture is just how, I guess, salient the frame remained from 1974 to 1992 and onward. And so, but I was actually, as I was thinking about this, I looked up the voting map, and at the time of the vote, a large amount of what we would have called the Front Range of Colorado actually supported the Front Range, and the western side of the Rockies did actually vote in support of passing the amendment. But it was basically the range itself, meaning the Rockies, meaning the mountain counties themselves that didn't. And so, I mean, Boulder is in the foothills, right? But I'm curious, like, to what extent did you find, or how? I'm thinking about, the connection between a certain kind of performance and articulation of masculinity and the mountain rugged individualist, and and then its antithesis, which is to say, like, whether or not you make space for women. I'm curious, like, what is going on there, and why do you think that this argument or the framing of preferential rights is still so salient in 92 as it was in 74, and still echoes in some parts of the country today? Yeah.
Can I actually ask I think a related question, which is, what are the people who you voted said that gay people needed to, quote unquote, earn their rights? Yeah. And I'm also curious what that means to those people.
Yeah. Okay. Let me think about that, earning one's rights, for a second. And the question about Amendment 2, so this is like 1992, it's like peak, like these anti-gay initiatives are just happening everywhere. And Amendment 2 is a place, Colorado's again a place where conservatives win big. And not only do they win, it invalidates any local anti-discrimination laws. And so by this point, Boulder did have an anti-discrimination laws. And then the only other places were Denver did, but also it was like Aspen, and a lot of the ski towns had anti-abortion or anti-discrimination laws, gay anti-discrimination laws. So Amendment 2 wins, and it invalidates all these anti-discrimination laws. And so this is like a moment where gay activists are already only really centered on metropolitan voters. They really are not working in rural places at all. And like, you have these evangelical, by this point, they're like largely evangelical alongside like Catholic anti-abortion activists doing this work, who are doing more with rural places. But what they say is like, in the aftermath, you have smaller towns, especially like Aspen. They're like, those aren't really Colorado. And those aren't real small towns. Like, those are all shaped by external, like, gay forces, i.e. Hollywood. You know what I mean? And the ski industry. They said those aren't real. And because they're already narrating that gay cannot be originally from like the real West, the real small town, the real, it has to be a sort of insidious outside force that has made those small towns particularly like gay friendly. And they like like there's all these like, I don't know, there's a boycott of Colorado in the aftermath. And then people sort of carve out, they're like, you could still go to the ski towns because like those places did have anti-discrimination ordinances. It's fine, and that just like continues to build this resentment about there was like a real Colorado and then the not real Colorado, and not real is like Boulder for sure, but then also these like ski towns. And so I think that by that point, they were still using the same arguments, but a lot of this sexual political geography has already shifted as a product of political realignments in the way that movements have like re-narrated the place of their allies, And so, so Amendment 2 is really like, I mean, one person is like, the only time people don't really talk about this, this particular campaign, but when they do, they're like, this was a precursor to that. Yeah. And of course, Colorado Springs sort of becomes like the centerpiece there for that movement. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Earning your rights. Yeah, I mean, I think that she didn't really articulate what it meant, but I think that which is useful, right? You're like, what does it mean to earn your rights? I think she thought of them as fundamentally bad citizens, right? That they were already lawbreakers. It sort of didn't matter that like what was under, like that the laws were already changed. Maybe they weren't lawbreakers anymore anyway, you know what I mean? But like they seemed to be corruptors and lawbreakers, and that you had to be whatever it meant to be a good contributing citizen. And of course, like gay students they're saying over and over again, they're like, gay people are contributing. They're already like employed. People also, employers already know that they're employed. Like they're employed, they're doing all this civic work. That was the pitch of gay liberation. They were like, we are contributing citizens and therefore we deserve to be protected from discrimination. But that wasn't the vision, right, of queer people. And I think that's what Mary Connor meant, but it's so illuminating because like it is I think conservatives in many movements realize that's not the way you say it, even though that's what you mean, you know. And so it's so illuminating for this particular conservative to be like, no, I'm gonna say it. Like equal rights is not what we value. Unequal rights is the way it should be. So you know, and later, like those voices just quickly get like muffled. You're like, no, you might say that behind closed doors, but you don't say that forward facing to a reporter, you know? So, yeah.
This time you were saying that a lot of the anti-gay was motivated like Catholic groups. And when did that switch to evangelical happening?
Yeah.
How did that?
So Anita Bryant comes out. I mean, I think that's one of the people have sort of read all of this movement as evangelical entirely. And it does, like, evangelicals lead it very quickly. And the Catholic Church is very clear about abortion, and Catholics lead that movement for a really long time. But Catholics are a little bit more divided for a whole host of reasons around homosexuality. They just seem less. I mean, even before the Southern Baptist Convention fully goes conservative, like before that, before they've committed themselves to an anti-abortion platform, they are already like committing themselves to oppose gay rights. So partly like religious organizations have really like set the stage for this. Catholics are just step back just a little bit, and evangelical religious organizations step forward, and that allows for, I think, evangelicals to lead often. But what I found is that like over and over again, you do have evangelicals who lead, but there are always Catholics there, and they're always Catholics from the anti-abortion movement. They're like anti-abortion activists are the Catholics who are deeply embedded in these socially conservative coalitions. So in some of the later initiatives, you have Catholic leadership in a state being like, we don't support this. Those Catholics don't speak for us. They do speak for us on abortion, but they don't speak for us here. But these anti-abortion groups join up and give their support to the anti-gay groups and become these activists. So I think that evangelicals still in 1974, social conservatives they didn't have organizations, I think. And I think these people really saw this connection between like around sexual modernity that they were opposing. But so anti-abortion activists would always remain, but here they were just the front in a way that they don't really that's not true later, but they always remain there.
I've got a couple of questions. The first one might be nothing, but I thought it was interesting the framing of the anti-queer movement as sort of framing some of their demands as a defense of white straight workers.
Yeah.
So one question is, did the organized labor intervene in the debate in any way, or did they kind of stay out of it? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, what happens to Hilda Skinner? Because she's a fascinating character. I was thinking it's partly because she strikes me as the sort of person, maybe, perhaps, if she was around now, might be given a show on Fox.
Oh, yeah, right.
But you mentioned that she's sort of cast out by some of her co-movement organizers because she's seen as a little bit too radical, and she's seen as discrediting the movement. But I can imagine under certain circumstances, she might be celebrated by people in the anti-queer movement outside of the state, for example. Does that happen? And do you know really what happens to her afterwards?
Yeah. So Organized labor. So I haven't found anything in this where organized labor really sort of comes out. But so 4 years later is the Briggs Initiative in California. And that's the first statewide anti-gay initiative. And so this was a law, this was an initiative that said, and at that point, it was legal to be a gay teacher. But that initiative said you couldn't, you'd be immediately fired, and anyone said anything positive about gay people would be fired too. So it was like inserting discrimination where there wasn't already. And their organized labor, the teachers union, are big supporters. They're big opponents of the anti-gay initiative, right? Because they make the argument this is an attack on all workers, right? That anytime you regulate speech this way or this is just it's going to cascade down. So that, and then not only the teachers union, but they get the Teamsters. I mean, there's really this elaborate effort by gay movements to get organized labor as a partner in those movements, and they do it. And some people credit that along with some of their other support with really gay activists win, right, in 1978. But here I don't really, I think maybe because it was so local, it was confined to the city.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a lot of labor conversations, even though that would make a lot of sense. And then, Hilma. Hilma, she was just a little before her time, she not only gets cast out of the anti-gay movement, but she's briefly in the anti-ERA movement in Colorado. And it's not clear exactly what happened, but she gets cut out of that too. She was in a leadership position, and all of a sudden she was out. And then she just she had this moment where she's really, and I think she still a thorn in people's side. She comes to meetings and stuff and city council meetings as the audience, but she's not in organizations the same way as she was. And then she just for sure falls out of, but I think if she had lasted 3-4 more years, things would have changed. But it was just she was between 1970 and 1976. And she's just she's this voice, and then she's just sort of out. And I think if she just hung on a few years later, she would have been a really valued part of these kind of movements, but she just doesn't. So yeah, Hilma, she's so interesting. I mean, they sort of she's sort of the stereotype, but I think that she's easily, not by the people at the time, but I think since people are oh yeah, you can just dismiss her. But no, actually, Hilma, I think is the recall committee, but Hilma also is this sign of things to come.